Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a time for a reasonable lunch and maybe a breath of fresh air before we recommence. Thanks to everybody for a very stimulating session this morning. I thoroughly enjoyed it and lots of good ideas coming out. And Gail, who's sitting alongside me, has been collecting and will collate all the points that have been raised so we don't lose anything. And it was good to get that undertaking from the Cabinet Secretary that she would take them forward, and we'll get responses and copy them out to everybody. So thank you. I'm going to kick off this afternoon's session and welcome Magnus Davidson to give the next talk about electricity generation in the Highlands and Islands. Magnus has many strings to his bow, and as well as being a research associate with UHI, he's also the youngest board member of Community Land Scotland. And his research portfolio is wide and interesting, and it couldn't really be more apposite for this event than it is. He's worked focusing on setting out a new vision for 21st century rural Scotland, and his portfolio stretches across energy, climate, land use, development, and conservation. So easy issues to resolve there, Magnus. So energy should be a quite simple one for you to tackle. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Magnus.
Perfect. Thank you very much there. And thank you very much for inviting me along. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to get everything set up. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, everything's working fine.
Perfect. And I'll start my stopwatch. Try keep me on time. I can talk about this stuff all day. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me along. Always nice to follow a cabinet secretary. So whoever put the programme together, thank you very much for that. I'll cut straight to the chase, and that was an excellent introduction. Thank you, Robert. Yeah, amongst many of my research interests, energy, and particularly energy generation in the Highlands and Islands, is one of them. I'm based in Caithness in Thurso, although I have family links to Sutherland and spend a huge amount of time in Sutherland and know Sutherland very well. You can see actually a picture of myself and my new baby daughter on the right-hand side outside my house, which I am a social housing tenant, and I actually use electric storage heaters on total heat, total control. I am not in fuel poverty, but I do ration heat in my home. So I'm just putting this into my introduction to say I don't just study these issues, I also live them as well. I've just put the new bill I got through from SSE at the bottom, showing the prices I'll be paying, or am now paying, for electricity, which are quite incredible, to be honest. Today, I'm going to run through electricity generation in the Highlands and Islands region, asking questions like how much renewable electricity do we produce as a region? What percentage of electricity consumption is met by renewable generation? How do these figures compare across the 5 constituent local authority areas? This morning, I was actually pulling out the Sutherland figures that I thought would be quite nice for this. Required a little bit of work, but they're quite interesting in themselves. So how much electricity does Sutherland use and generate? And then I'll give some additional suggestions and future trends and commentary on the figures. For those who've seen some of this presentation at HEHO, I'll apologise, but I have added to it, and I think added some quite interesting commentary. So the region as a whole, we produce a lot of renewable electricity, largely from wind and hydro. Our annual consumption is a lot lower than our actual generation. So we produce over 300% of our own electricity consumption from renewable sources. We're a net exporter to the rest of Scotland. However, large differences do exist within the local authority areas. Starting in the north and working south, in Shetland, annual generation of 44 gigawatt hours of renewable electricity from onshore wind. This isn't as much as the consumption, so we see around 23% of electricity consumption from renewables. There's no current export capacity, and much of this is met from fossil fuel generation. But for those of you who know Shetland, you'll know and understand this is all changing and going to change, and I'll allude to that a bit later on. In Shetland, 31% of dwellings are in fuel poverty. I'll keep referring back to this graph and again make some commentary on it at the end. In Orkney, an island grouping that knows renewable energy very well and is in fact a world leader in many senses, we see more renewable electricity generated than we see consumed. There is some export capacity to the mainland here into Caithness, most of which comes from onshore wind, with a small amount from the Marine Centre, European Marine Energy Centre. It is a net exporter, as I said, via a small connection to the mainland. But yeah, fantastic things in Orkney. And it was actually a number of years ago, Orkney made the headlines for hitting above 100% renewable electricity generation in the BBC. And it was what spurred me to go away and to look at other local authorities in the area. So thank you to Orkney for stimulating this piece of research. In Orkney, 21% of dwellings are in fuel poverty, higher than the Scottish average. In Highland, this one's very close to my heart, coming from the Highlands, living in the Highlands, Sutherland, of course, being in the Highland region as well. We produce a lot of renewable electricity, mostly from onshore wind, some from hydro, some from biomass at the plant on the way out to Dalcross. Some from marine. We've got the world's largest tidal stream array in the inner sound in the Pentland Firth, but in terms of total capacity, it's not a huge amount, but will hopefully be growing bigger over the next number of years, if not decades. We generate significantly more than we consume, so we generate over 400% of our own electricity consumption. We have very good export capacity to the rest of Scotland when you think about things like the Beauly-Denny line and the Caithness-Murray underwater link. In Highland, 1/3 of dwellings fall in fuel poverty, again higher than the national average. I've just included this map here that I've taken from the Scottish Government Energy Statistics database, and it's just to highlight in sheer volume how much more renewable electricity Highland produce than other local authority areas. Visually speaking, it's quite a remarkable map more than anything. South of Scotland, again, they produce a fair amount of renewable electricity, also suffers of fuel poverty, but maybe not as high pricing as we see here. So just use this as a visual representation to really showcase the sheer volume of electricity generated within the region itself. Nahilan share, hopefully my pronunciation isn't too bad here. Apologies if it's not as good as you could have hoped, but annual electricity about the same, consumption about the same as generation. These statistics are all from 2019, by the way. They're the most recent statistics that we've got. Hopefully soon we'll have the ones from 2020, and I'll quite happily update this whole presentation with those statistics for if that would be useful, and share them widely. In fact, we're probably above 100% there now. There is a small amount of export capability, which has very much been in the news over the last 12 months, especially with that breaking down, and especially the impact that has had on community generators, for example. Over 40% of dwellings in fuel poverty here, significantly high, the highest in Scotland. We'll again kind of get to that a wee bit later on. Argyll and Bute, I often think, or maybe I've been caught out at times thinking that, or what I should say really is this figure has caught me out in the past in terms of being higher than I might have thought. But they produce a lot of renewable electricity as well from onshore wind, from big hydro dams as well. Annual consumption of around 506 gigawatt hours of electricity, and generates 281% of its own electricity consumption. So good export capacity there, also quite close to some of the big consuming populations in Glasgow. Argyll and Bute have 32% of dwellings in fuel poverty. With this being the most southern local authority area, I'll just draw attention to this graph in itself. And I think 5 of the 7 local authority areas which are above the Scottish national average for fuel poverty are all found in the Highlands and Islands, the other which is of Moray and Dundee City. Moray is also an interesting example here because that's where landfall cables or cables make landfall for the big offshore wind farms in off the Caithness coast and off the Moray coast. So there's a credible case for many of the points I put forward here to be made about Moray as well. What you might find most interesting out of this presentation is I've tried to draw out some of these figures for Sutherland. When you get below local authority area, it becomes difficult, or the government agency involved don't make these statistics available for anything below local authority area. So I've had to go away and play with some of other numbers and kind of come to these with some calculations. So these are my calculations rather than the government's, but I think they're pretty good, to be honest. So an annual consumption of around 97.5 gigawatt hours with annual generation of 889 gigawatt hours, mainly from wind, some big wind farms, but also we know a lot of hydro, a lot of small scale hydro and some bigger hydro schemes at Shin, for example. So almost close to 1,000% of electricity consumption being met by renewables, 912, incredible significant amount. Just to say, these figures have been adapted from work I've done for Caithness and North Sutherland Regeneration Partnership, looking at almost an energy audit and looking at hydrogen capability in the Caithness and North Sutherland area. That report has just been finalised, and it may be of interest to people in this group, and it can be found from, I think, CNSRP, or I'm quite happy to share it with people myself once I get the nod from them. In terms of looking at future trends, we'll see increased onshore wind generation on island groups, largely thanks to the subsidy made available by the UK government. We're seeing that built out at the moment with the Shetland wind farm and Viking. Not uncontroversial in itself for a multitude of reasons, and I think we'll see large-scale onshore wind developments in island groups receive increasing scrutiny. Effectively, to kind of summarise that, the Scottish government, perhaps UK government of times, have looked to almost build offshore wind farms on island groups. That's not been met with the best response. We'll also see greater interconnectedness with island groups to get this new island wind and potentially more offshore renewables to make landfall. We are seeing 600 megawatt interconnector being built out in Shetland at the moment, proposals for the Orkney, a bigger connection there. And again, not confirmed or failed. This is a bit open for interpretation at the moment, but the interconnector for the Western Isles. Probably worth suggesting at this point, a lot of the innovation that we've seen come out of Orkney in the energy sector has actually been through the lack of interconnectedness and the requirement for Orkney to do stuff effectively, for want of a better term, with their excess renewable capacity. Here in the Highlands, we just export everything south because the grid connection's that good. We'll see a greater increase in offshore generation. You can see on the right-hand side the ScotWind leasing round, and you can see where most of this is really met. Just one word of warning, the size of these developments aren't comparable to the actual capacity. So you can see on the right-hand side, E1 is really big, but it's actually not a huge amount of capacity compared to some of the other areas in terms of the size. So we see significant amounts of offshore wind off Caithness and East Sutherland coasts, as well as the north coast of Sutherland. We'll also seen plans for the Pentland Firth floating development just off Dounreay at the minute. We'll also see an increase in renewable generation in the Highlands and Islands and an increase in export to the rest of Scotland. So this is some professional commentary here. Sorry, I'm just checking my timing. We'll see net transfer out of the Highlands and Islands, and this is actually vital to decarbonise Scotland and the UK. Exporting from the Highlands and Islands is no bad thing. We have a huge amount of resource, and that resource needs to generate electricity, and that electricity needs to decarbonise Scotland. We can't expect to build enough renewables in Glasgow to decarbonise Glasgow, for example. We do see increased renewable capacity in Highland and Islands. It will be needed. these figures are actually a really useful tool in discussing fuel poverty, and I really hope that you can take some of these away with you to use them in lobbying, use them to discuss these kind of issues. They're a hugely important tool, a very powerful tool at times, but we need to take care with using some of these statistics that we don't use these figures in a way that could be perceived as being anti-renewable. Why? On the right-hand side, I show you a graph that shows in 2019, where all these figures were taken from, Scotland only produced just under a quarter of total final energy demand from renewable sources. So we were roughly in 2020 meeting about 100% of electricity demand from renewables, but total final energy demand significantly lower. If you look at renewable heat on the right-hand side, you see we're only meeting about 3.3% of the target. Huge amount of work needs to go into decarbonising the rest of our economy. That means more electricity generation from renewable sources. We need to build more renewables. A lot of that will come offshore, but potentially more onshore. I've hidden this little bit just away some of the text, and I checked this while I was eating my lunch to see what we were doing with some of this electricity. And despite one of the reactors being down, I think at Torness, we are exporting a lot of the renewable electricity that we're generating here in Scotland at the moment to England. 2.2 gigawatts at the moment. A lot of that may be from nuclear, a lot of it may be from renewables. It depends how you define the electrons in the line. Some personal commentary here, and this is very personal. So yeah, I should have maybe even taken the logos off this slide, but fuel poverty, especially within sight of wind turbines and hydro dams, is a national disgrace. Governments, and I put governments here because I think it falls to UK, Scottish and local government, but they're failing on delivering a just transition. I've taken this quote from the Just Transition Commission report that says, for a just transition, we need to ensure that no one suffers from fuel poverty directly as a result of the net zero transition. Because of the increased amount put on electricity bills for environmental and social considerations. I think Brian Leask actually alluded to this in the comments earlier. We are today, right now, at this moment, seeing people in fuel poverty directly as a result of the transition to net zero. The high generation, high fuel poverty we see here in the Highlands and Islands in Sutherland itself is a result of a complex system, antiquated system at times. Both reserved and devolved governments play a part here with no easy answers on solutions. However, I will propose just one of my own. At the moment, we've just seen that the ScotWind offshore wind leasing round that I alluded to earlier coming to a close. We're seeing hundreds of millions of pounds, up to close to £1 billion. We probably won't see that cap met, but we will see hundreds of millions of pounds flow from private companies to government, the Scottish government, with ScotWind leasing round for the right to develop. This is just purely the right to develop. Subsequently, the companies will then pay leasing fees when those wind farms they develop become operational. We're going to see hundreds and hundreds, if not billions of pounds flowing from private companies to the Scottish government to exploit offshore wind resource. My suggestion, many other people, I think Margaret Davidson was in the Press and Journal yesterday with this. I know I'm involved with a number of groups, and many other groups are proposing this. Hamish Trench from the Scottish Land Commission, in fact, was in the P&G over the last couple of weeks proposing this for taxation of carbon credits. But it all kind of feeds into this one sovereign fund. Oops. The idea would be to portion off some of this into a sovereign fund that would become self-sustainable to deliver capital to communities to deliver on local community wealth building approaches to fuel poverty. These wouldn't be grants, these would be loans, so that sovereign wealth fund becomes self-sustainable. It delivers perhaps on past failures we've seen in the oil and gas sector, and it allows the nation, not just rural communities, but the nation to benefit from this national resource. So I think that we should be talking very carefully about how much gets to communities who are close to this resource, but we should also be talking about, as this resource potentially goes further offshore, how we can get some to say inner city communities and communities in Glasgow, for one example, who also need to decarbonise. At the very end here, this is my last slide. I've put in a quote from Douglas Fraser, I think the economist, the editor for the BBC in Scotland at least, who's said, what we've seen as a very heavily subsidised sector is now turning into a cash cow for government. My proposition here to the government, to the cabinet secretaries, to the ministers, is for the government to reinvest this money back into communities in Sutherland who are suffering from fuel poverty. That's been a bit of a whirlwind. Hopefully you've managed to keep it all on, take it all in. Please get in touch directly. My email's there for references, for figures, more detail. I would love to share this research with as many people if you think that it would be useful for you to make your own kind of case in this. I think that's probably me used up pretty much most of my time. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm very much looking forward to answering questions if I have the opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Magnus. That was an excellent presentation, and I can feel the blood boiling throughout the country at the moment in relation to the amount of electricity generated, used, and exported, and lack of benefits derived locally. I think there's several comments to that effect. So hopefully everybody can get their blood pressure down a bit now. But thanks indeed, that was very useful. And what I was particularly gladdened to see was your potential solutions there in relation to the partition. I think there's something there that I think a number of agencies are starting to grab onto, and I think it does offer a solution at scale and at local scale as well. So very encouraging. Thanks indeed, and there will be a question and answer session at the end of the current round of speakers. So thank you. I'm now going to turn to Professor Donald Hirsch, and Donald's research has been alluded to at various stages over the presentations and discussions to date. He's been working in the field of fuel poverty for 20 years. His chair is in the director of the Centre for Research and Social Policy at Loughborough University. And I think from a Highlands and Islands perspective, he was involved in that seminal piece of research that was done that led to the first round of the minimum income standard being looked at in 2013, I think it was. And it's great to see that that's now been adopted by the Scottish Government in relation to the fuel poverty definition. And I'm encouraged that that has happened, and there's been a lot of lobbying, and the logic and compelling case of a research has spoken to anybody that's taken the time and trouble to look at it. So Donald, without further ado, and not to eat up into your time, if you would like to present now, thank you.
Can you see my slide? Can you see my slide, Robert?
Yes, I can see it clearly.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'll try and be as brisk as possible. Yes, I mean, the story starts about 15 years ago when we started to look across the UK at what people needed for a minimum acceptable standard of living, which we call the minimum income standard. And we've been doing that ever since for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, based on what ordinary people think are the necessities of life. And then almost 10 years ago, Di Alexander and Alistair Nicholson from the Highlands and Islands Enterprise, who I was pleased to see here earlier, came along and said, well, you know, but it costs a lot more to live up here in the remote parts of Scotland. And can we do a study of the additional costs, which we did. And sure enough, it did show that it cost more. And sort of, you know, almost 10 years later, last week, the Scottish Government actually published our report, which is linked into the fuel poverty measure. So it's been a long road, but I think that it's about recognition of the additional costs, both of fuel and of other living costs in remote rural Scotland, and how does this actually feed into to fuel poverty. So a few sort of overview questions are very current. Is the current increase in fuel poverty going to, in fuel prices, going to feed into fuel poverty? And are we going to see a massive rise in fuel poverty? How does that relate to other remote living costs in determining it? And does the Scottish Government now recognise, has it changed its attitudes to costs, which it was hesitant to systematically recognise in the past? And my quick answer to those questions is, interestingly, I mean, I actually wrote this slide last week, and things have really changed since then. And if we see the kinds of increases that some people have predicted, then of course it's going to feed into fuel poverty. But it's not really automatic. It's not inevitable that every rise in fuel prices will greatly increase the number of people in fuel poverty, because there are lots of different influences on that. But it will definitely, for those who are in fuel poverty, it will definitely automatically increase the depth of fuel poverty, because by definition they'll have to spend more, and they'll be in more desperate straits. And so I'm going to, my emphasis, my particular thing which I'm going to be talking about is about not fuel costs, but the other remote rural living costs. And these are both important, because it both affect how much you have left to live on at the end of the day. Has the Scottish Government's attitude to costs in remote rural areas changed? I think I heard Kate Forbes say that she was unashamed to say we do recognise this particular need of this area, and so I think there's been a lot of progress in that recognition. Now, this is a sort of slightly interesting and provocative graph, which shows that fluctuations in fuel prices, which is the upper line, hasn't necessarily been reflected automatically in the fuel poverty rate, at least on the old definition. And as I say, this is because lots of things are going on, but it really depends on how sharply that fuel price goes up. So just don't think it's all about fuel prices. And part of the problem, of course, is that there's a bit of a perfect storm, that all the other influences, such as on incomes and on non-fuel costs, non-domestic fuel costs, so also petrol costs and things, are also going in the same direction. So I'm not trying to say things aren't going to deteriorate, but it's going to be a combination of different factors that do it. So it was nice to hear Rebecca say that actually, for people out there, it's not important how we define fuel poverty. They know it when they see it, and I 100% agree with that. But I'm now going to sort of, because we over the next few years with the legislation, we're going to be hearing a lot about which ways the figures are going. It's worth understanding what they tell you, so that we can interpret what they do and don't tell you. So the traditional definition was, you've got total income shown in these combined bars, and if more than 10% shown in the top portion, if that sort of expands and beyond 10%, and it sort of goes, it starts to encroach on other expenses. That goes without saying, and that's the sort of 10% rationale. But if you think about people on different incomes, these sort of examples here, where in each case 10% is being spent on fuel, you'll notice that actually the people who start off on higher incomes have got quite a lot left to spend on other things, even if they're spending 10% on fuel, rather than the people at the bottom. So why are we saying that people are in fuel poverty who are on the right, when they've got plenty to live on? And so the extra bit of the new definition, of course, is that it's both spending at least 20% on fuel and being below, and that sort of dark bar being below that line, that Ms line. In other words, that it doesn't come up to the residual income, that these remaining costs, what you have for the remaining costs, don't actually cover what your costs are. And that's where the minimum income standard is used for Scotland as a whole. But in addition, let's just think about what if we think now about that equation, where if that bottom bar doesn't come above the line, then you've got too little in residual income. What are the different changes that can increase fuel poverty? And so the first thing is that income can go down. And that's very important at the moment, because as we've heard, a lot of people have had a £20 a week cut in their income, and that's going to push some people into fuel poverty. We must recognise that, and that this is what would happen in this example, where the lower bar isn't coming up to the line. The second thing, of course, which is most of what we're talking about today, is the different influences on people's fuel costs, and I'm not going to go through those. And so if the fuel costs go up, then that as I say, can create even deeper poverty in this example, because that bar that bottom bar is way below that line. But then the other thing is that you can have higher other living costs, so that MIS line, the minimum income standard line, is higher, as we have in this area, in the remote rural areas such as Sutherland. And of course, the big victory in the legislation was to recognise that by having a higher threshold of these other living costs, the income which you have left after paying for fuel, is to be set at a higher level for people living in areas defined as remote in the sixfold classification of urban and rural areas. And so this sort of dotted line which you're seeing here, and the difference between that and the solid line is what our research is about. It's how much higher a threshold do you need to reach when you're measuring fuel poverty. So this is the report that we've produced, and as I say, it came out last week. It was produced by our team at Loughborough in partnership with Amanda Bryan and Joe Ellen, who are people who are consultants who worked on the original study and who live in the Highlands, and so have a lot of local knowledge and helped us to price things. And it involved sort of talking to a lot of groups of people in this area. But let me just tell you very briefly about the study then. So first of all, this is actually about a definition which says you first of all look at income net of housing costs. You then look at how much you need to spend on fuel, and if that's 10% or more of that income net of housing costs, then that's one condition. And then the residual income, what you have left after the amount you need to spend on fuel, is that below the minimum income standard. And so this threshold is about a residual income after what you spend on fuel. And that means that when we do this study, we're not actually, in this case, unlike when we were looking at it before, we're not actually looking at fuel as a cost, basically because we don't need to, because this is about actually doing the measure, and we don't need to, because when you do the survey, when you have the Scottish House Conditions Survey, you're already looking directly at the individual households at what their required fuel spending is. So it's after you've taken that off, it's saying, well, what do you need to have left? And that's why this study is about the non-fuel additions. And so we did the standard minimum income standard research, which involves talking in detail to groups of people about what certain sorts of households need. And we talked to people in remote rural areas throughout the islands and the mainland remote areas, and we compared. We sort of started off with the UK budgets of what was needed, and we compared those, and then, as I say, we used local people with a lot of local knowledge to do the costings. So it's a simplified study. Its purpose is to work out the uplift in creating this monitoring of fuel poverty with this measure and target. And what we have is we have some percentage uplifts for a percentage uplift for families with children, pensioners, and working age without children. We worked out a single percentage for each of those for mainland remote rural Scotland, and the other one was for the island, another set for the islands. we're not trying, we haven't been able to look in fine detail about how it varies from one community to another. We have taken into account some of the very remote costs, but we've done that through kind of weighted averages, because we were focused on trying to get an overall picture rather than describing each area in detail. And so in some ways, in combination with some of the interesting nuances we got about individual local places in the report we published in 2013, this does actually then complement that by giving it across the whole area's average. So the key finding, as I think Di mentioned, is that for these costs, these non-fuel costs, you need to spend between 15 and 30% more, depending on which demographic group you're in, and whether you're islands or mainland, in order to measure fuel poverty, according to the government's definition. This is where you set the MIS line. Now, by far, the biggest item is actually to do with travel, and travel to work, travel to shop, reach communities, overwhelmingly by car, but it's just so much more than the minimum would be in an urban area where people can use public transport and I don't have to travel so far. And then there are other items which make smaller contributions. We took account of local food shopping, and either sort of top-up shopping for people who can occasionally regularly get supermarkets, or in the case of the islands, people who really have to do all their food shopping in remote locations, most remote locations, not towns. Some additional clothing, climate related mainly, postage and delivery, and then a few purchases which are to do with living in a particular way, like a larger fridge freezer to store more food, and an oil heater to give auxiliary power. And so you can see here that the bottom bar, the red bar, is this is the single person who has 20% higher minimum household costs of these items. The bottom red bar is the starting point. Then travel is most of the addition, and there are a few other additions like household services, mainly to do with delivery and postage. These are weekly amounts. So about £40. The main thing is that this single person have to spend about £40 a week more than they would, and even though than they would in an urban area. And even though this is incomplete, it doesn't include fuel. I mean, £40 is £40, and if we go by the study we did before, you've probably got about half as much, up to half as much again, maybe up to £20 a week more on fuel. But that depends a lot on your individual situation, and so we're not trying to measure that on this occasion. We looked at the additions for a couple with 2 children, very similar, also 21%. And for pensioners who start off with well, it's a single pensioner, so they'll start off with a much lower budget than a couple with 2 children. They had a particularly high percentage uplift of 31%, because it's just, compared with traveling, getting free bus travel, you can imagine what it's like to have to own a car and the costs of that. And there are also some social and cultural things which are related to extra costs when you go on holiday. So those are the main results. So I'd just now then like to talk about 6 key influences on fuel poverty in this context, and where things are going. Just a bit about where things are going. So obviously, the first one is the energy required to heat a home, and that's what most of this conference is about. And it will depend on energy efficiency measures. As Kate Forbes said, people's behaviours and the way they use heat, home design, climate. I don't know whether you're going to get a benefit from warming. I'm told by Di that there's so much wind that you probably won't. But these are obviously going to have a huge effect. And of course the
2 minutes, Donald. Sorry, Donald. 2 minutes.
Yeah, the cost of domestic fuel, I already talked about. And what's interesting there is that if you compare it to the CPI over the last 10 years, it's actually pretty similar to what it was 10 years ago. We're thinking they go up, but we could be entering, of course, a completely new ballpark here, and you can see the start of the current rise in this graph. The third one is the adequacy of incomes. These are the numbers who across the UK live below MERS, and this will be affected by universal credit and so on. And that's about, it's gone up from about a quarter to about 30%. So incomes is going to be a big issue now going forward, and it'll have been affected by the pandemic. Here's an interesting one. The big thing that I was saying about the biggest cost apart from the fuel we're talking about today is this other kind of fuel, which is petrol and diesel, because travel is so important. And it's really interesting to see that we remember that it's gone up recently, but actually we don't remember that actually 10 years ago nearly it was pretty similar to now. So what happens to that is going to be very important. And then the final one, which I think is going to be very interesting, is will there be a knock-on effect of all the kind of difficulties we're having at the moment in terms of how much that people charge for delivery, the cost of shopping locally. Some of these supply chain things could have real effects on other things other than just petrol and household fuels, which affect these things. This is just showing basically that what people have said before, that the triangles show fuel poverty in local authorities, and the squares show child poverty, which is just another sort of general poverty measure. And that what this is showing is that in areas which are having high fuel poverty, all these areas we're talking about aren't necessarily poor in other respects, especially before you take into account additional costs. So on standard measures, they're not poor, but once you take into account the additional costs, which these do, because it's approximating these new conditions. I'm doing work for Shetland. We've done work for Shetland showing that some of the things which determine how resources are direct, which is the standard poverty measures, just don't capture these extra fuel poverty effects. Four quick conclusions. So it's been said, some of the things which fuel poverty is influenced by can be controlled, others can't. But it's not just what you pay for your household fuel, it's other household costs, of which energy is really important. Energy is important, not just what you pay for electricity or heating oil or gas for those who have it. It's also about petrol. And so the same things are going to feed into those other living costs. And so an integrated anti-fuel poverty strategy needs not just to address the cost of fuel, but it needs to address income and the costs of other things, which really, and so my final thought is this. It's a bit provocative. Fuel poverty may be tackled by making your home energy efficient, but being able to work from that home may be just as important, because then you won't have to travel as much, and you may need to have some better broadband to do so. That's me.
Donald, thank you very much indeed. And there's several things I take from that. I think the most salient one is we have this robust set of data now, going back for a number of years, that is unarguable when we have discussions with government or others who are looking to do interventions that work. And what your research shows us is where it needs to happen, where those interventions need to happen. And I'm really glad that the government picked that up in relation to getting that data from your organisation on a regular basis. And hopefully from your talk there, everybody now fully understands how valuable it is. It's something that we can use for lots of things that we're trying to present cases on, and B, as it's repeatable in the future, we can see what effect inputs are having. Changes in strategies. Is it actually working, or is it not? And I think all of us that are involved in policy development, we should be looking to seeing what the impacts are. Your research will be one of the key methods that we will have to evaluate how good we are at addressing particular issues. So thanks indeed for that, and hopefully there will be some questions coming up shortly. But we've got one more speaker before we go to questions, and that's Hannah Dunn. Hannah's a researcher in change work. She works in their consultancy team, and they've undertaken some fairly fundamental research in recent years. One of the ones that they've been doing recently is going to be what Hannah speaks about just now. So I'm not going to steal your thunder, Hannah. I'm just going to let you go straight into it. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Bob. I think I'm the only speaker today that's recorded their presentation, so probably no risks of me going over time, but I'll share that with you shortly. I'll just share my screen. So can everyone see that okay? Oh, hold on. No, because I haven't shared it yet. There we go. Right, there we go. Is that right?
Yes, that's working fine.
Perfect. Right. So, yeah, thank you so much for having us here today. I'm going to be talking you through a project that we've been working on in partnership with the European Climate Foundation, and it's regarding decarbonisation models with a view to kind of ensure this just transition that people have been speaking about for low carbon heating, in particular for off-gas areas. So I'll play this and hopefully you can hear it okay, but do let me know if there's issues with the sound. That's on full, right. If it plays. As many of you are probably already aware, in response to the Paris Agreement, the Scottish Government did publish their climate change plan, and the most recent 2018 to 2032 update does set some ambitious targets for Scotland to see net zero emissions by 2045. There is an interim goal of 75% reduction in emissions by 2030, which in the grand scheme of things is not that far away. And in order to reach these goals, the Scottish Government have suggested that 50% of buildings will need to be converted to low or zero carbon heating by 2030. So these necessitate quite a fundamental shift in the way that we use heat and use energy in our homes, and the speed and scale at which these changes will be required to happen to meet these targets may create situations in which certain groups of people are left behind. So the idea of a just transition has been circulating for some time, and it aims to ensure that nobody is left behind or disproportionately affected by the transition to net zero or decarbonisation. And to help manage this, the Scottish Government implemented their Just Transition Commission in 2019 with the aim to provide a fairer and greener future for all by supporting those who might be disproportionately affected by decarbonisation. The purpose of the Commission is to advise Scottish ministers on how to apply the Just Transition principles. And on the 23rd of March of this year, the Commission published this document, their National Mission for a Fairer, Greener Scotland. And it sets out their views of the key opportunities and the key challenges for Scotland and recommends practical steps to achieving a just transition. And in particularly, rural areas may face barriers not faced by those living in urban areas, such as disproportionately high energy costs, limited supply chains and limited infrastructure as well, which slows down the rate of uptake of these new decarbonisation technologies. Let me just make sure this is a... Right, I don't know where the sound is on this bit, but essentially I was just talking through the project that we were working on. Oh gosh, what a nightmare. I thought it'd be easier recording things, but we've been working with the European Climate Foundation. They funded this project here, and essentially they've discovered we've been working towards outlining 4 different models for sort of heat decarbonisation in off-gas areas, and essentially these 4 primary models that we identified. I'll see if I can just skip forward to that part. Right, there we go. I'll just skip forward to this bit here. A payment plan, community asset ownership, and third-party ownership. And I'll run through these in more detail shortly. Considered in isolation, it's all, and there should be a bit of flexibility in how these are potentially implemented throughout Scotland. So this first model here then is collective purchase, and it's essentially bulk buying just to help reduce the cost of heating and fabric upgrades to the homeowner. This happens already. Many off-gas communities will form oil clubs or co-ops to bulk purchase heating oil at cheaper rates, and those economies of scale are sort of passed down to the consumer. This model can be combined with various funding, whether that be grants or financial incentives, just to help reduce the initial upfront costs further of any of the heating system. This particular model, the occupant, whether that be the owner or a private or social tenant, would be responsible for the energy costs and network charges, which is essentially just your typical billing. The heating system would be funded and owned by the property owner, so there's no responsibility on the occupant repay for any heating upgrades. The property owner would also be responsible for any services or maintenance needed on the new heating system. And the group who are responsible for purchasing could be a self-organised local community group, social housing provider, or even a local authority. There are also options for third-party intermediaries or one-stop shops who provide additional services such as quality assurance, quality procurement and advice as well. So one example of this is the West Linton group buying scheme, which was led by Changeworks, where 51 residents signed up to the scheme to replace their oil or solid fuel heating systems with air source heat pumps, which were purchased in bulk by Changeworks. They were also responsible for the procurement of installers and liaise with contractors to provide kind of quality assurance services and further advice to householders as well. Householders saw benefits with regards to cheaper systems and also the sort of quality guarantee of the install as well. The project is still underway at the installation phase, with heat pumps being installed currently. Ultimately, Changeworks will be conducting some further monitoring and evaluation work, some further householder engagement to highlight the positive and negative aspects of the project and hope to inform similar projects in the future. So this model did receive a relatively high level of acceptance. One environmental policy organisation highlighted the fact that group buying is already very commonplace and it's an easily marketable concept. Housing Association suggested that the responsibility for bulk purchasing should lie at the government level or local government level, as they can access greater economies of scale and can afford the risks as well. And finally, as was highlighted by one community development trust, there may be a high degree of variability in rural and island housing, meaning that bulk purchasing of one type of system may not be beneficial for high numbers of properties in these areas and might not deliver the economies of scale needed for such a model. The second model, the payment plan model, removes the barriers of upfront costs, and the costs for heating and fabric upgrades are spread over time. There is potential to add servicing and maintenance included within the payment plans, and as with the collective purchase model, the occupier would be responsible for the energy costs and billing, and the owner is responsible for purchasing the technology and any servicing and fabric upgrades. Again, this model can be delivered through a number of financial mechanisms, including loans, equity release or equity loans, on-bill payments, or salary sacrifice schemes. Some other more complex mechanisms include comfort as a service, whereby the payment plan bundles the new heating system, any servicing or maintenance, as well as an agreed amount of energy for a fixed monthly price, and all in the one bill. And similar to mobile phone contracts, heat plans can be either pay-as-you-go or fixed price, depending on the amount of energy you think you might use. There are also green leases, which can be used, which help to bridge the divide between landlord and tenant by splitting the costs and benefits between the two. So both would financially input into the upgrading of the heating system. The occupant would have cheaper bills and a more comfortable home, and the property owner would have a new heating system in their property. Finally, there is property assessed clean energy, or PACE, which is common practice in the US and is being trialled in Europe, whereby repayments are made as part of property taxes and are based on the equity of the property. One example of this is the Rent on Bill pilot scheme, which has trialled the payment plan model in 4 pilot countries: Germany, Italy, Spain and Lithuania. And in this, 3 energy companies provided the upfront costs and delivered tailored offers, allowing for energy efficiency upgrades to be paid back through the householder's utility bills. Following the complete repayment of the improvements, the ownership then lay with the property owner and bills became cheaper once the repayment was complete. It was also noted that there were energy savings from the retrofit, which helped to offset the increase in bills when they included the repayments for the heating system. So during stakeholder engagement, one energy advice organisation felt that keeping the debt with the property was a good model in theory, as it had some protection for the consumer. However, there were concerns regarding the risks to consumers, with one housing association highlighting that the performance guarantee element is good, whose responsibility is it if those expected savings don't happen, and that it shouldn't fall onto the tenants through their energy bills or rents, so some sort of guarantee is needed to protect them. One community development trust felt this would be a rather exclusive model, as there is unequal access to borrowing for low-income households and also crofted houses who can't financially borrow against the value of the property, as with privately owned homes. The third model then is community asset ownership, where the heating assets are collectively owned by the users, as is currently the case on metered estates with communal LPG storage tanks. So this could include heat networks or shared ground arrays for individual heat pumps. This model could also be combined with technical solutions for multi-occupancy buildings such as tenements, or could even be as small scale as 2 semi-detached houses sharing an air source heat pump. Again, the owner would contribute financially to the communal heating system, and they would be responsible for maintenance of any technology within the property, and the occupant would still be responsible for any billing and network charges, as with the first 2 models. So the primary difference with this model is that a third party would be involved, and they would be used to manage the communal asset and provide sort of servicing and maintenance services for the asset as well. The third party can be funded through either network charges and billing, and the community would retain ownership of the communal system as well. This model would be quite suited for areas of clustered housing or small communities within villages, not necessarily an ideal solution for very dispersed populations or properties. So one example of this would be the Firle Low Carbon Heat Network, a village in East Sussex, and this project aimed to provide cheaper and lower carbon energy for householders. So to help manage this project, the Brighton and Hove Energy Services Cooperative was set up, and residents would pay a monthly charge through a heat supply agreement with the cooperative, similar to a comfort as a service model that I mentioned previously. So the cooperative, in partnership with Retrofit Works, are pursuing a fabric first approach, so improving the energy efficiency of each home first, and that would include as well the installation of 4 micro heat networks, which is essentially a sort of shared ground source heat pump, with the individual heat pumps in 22 properties in the village. So the ownership model is still unconfirmed, but the preferred option is for the system to be collectively owned in part by the residents of the village as well. This model did see the strongest opposition from stakeholders during consultation. A major theme which emerged from the engagement in relation to community-owned assets was the high risk and potential waste of resources where it could be applied elsewhere. There were ethical questions which were raised as to the appropriateness of communities being responsible for delivering energy, as well as community groups and members having to hold the burden of risk. Many communities don't have the technical expertise or know-how to help shape and manage these larger projects, relying on third parties to intervene. Though it was felt that this would help to engage local communities and assist with buy-in, working from a kind of ground-up approach. The final model is third-party ownership, where the third party pays the upfront cost to install the heating system and recoups that from users, whilst retaining ownership of the whole system itself. Now, the third party might be an energy service company or utility company, a local authority, or even a community group. The costs are recouped through a standing charge or added to monthly billing, or through comfort as a service plans, which I'd mentioned previously. This is the only model where occupants are required to pay towards the heating system via energy bills, whereas the property owner would only be required to pay for any energy efficiency measures or upgrades to the property. So, as well as providing the capital investment, the third party would own and operate the heating or microgrid infrastructure and are responsible for any servicing and maintenance as well. To further recoup investment costs, they can also derive value through access to data, grid balancing, and demand-side management if combined with some form of energy storage. These also help to offset the cost of infrastructure to consumers. So one example would be the Leicester District Energy Scheme, and this scheme was developed in partnership with ENGIE, the Leicester City Council, and the University of Leicester as well. So ENGIE are an energy services company, and the system would be wholly owned by them, and they would also be responsible for funding the project as well. So this allows the County Council and the university as well to transfer all technical and performance risks to the third party, who have the financial stability and the expertise to take on those risks. This project linked 4 district heating schemes, including a combined heat and power plant and a biomass heat network as well. And this was then extended to include Leicester City Council homes, including 3,000 dwellings on 6 housing estates, 19 public buildings, and also the University of Leicester to help provide cheaper, lower carbon energy. Oh, there doesn't be any sound here, but basically with the stakeholder kind of consultation, one housing association did say that there was an appetite for this type of model, but housing associations don't see themselves at the forefront of pioneering such things because of the risks. there was one consumer organisation that said that third-party ownership would be able to provide the capital and the financial investment that could support. This image gives them, I'm going to shut myself up there, that could drive these projects forward at a faster pace than potentially community-owned projects. And finally, as well, wait for this last point to come up. There was, where are we? There we go. Community Development Trust did say that potentially if the third parties were utility companies, there are already connections to consumers there and already an element of trust that could be the foundation of such projects. This image gives a more general but easily digestible view of how each model was perceived by the various stakeholder groups. So Model 1, collective purchase, showed the most positive response by stakeholders, with the socially rented sector saying they were in favour of the potential for cross-sector working, though there were concerns from the supply side that the market is lacking there with regards to variability in technology that can cater for the variability within housing in Scotland. Model 3 was the least favoured, so community asset ownership, and this was due to the time and resource required. However, the community or area-based aspects of the model were appealing as well. So with regards to next steps, we are still in phase 2 of this project and the stakeholder engagement is ongoing within the private rented sector. Successful implementation of any model will require steer and policy decisions and action from the Scottish Government. So ultimately this research is intended to be used as an evidence base to inform policy and the direction of travel for off-gas heat decarbonisation in Scotland. Changeworks will be consolidating the project outputs in the form of an accessible evidence-based call for action, targeting those in a position to act or contribute to realise an acceleration in the rollout of decarbonisation technologies. Perfect, and that's me. So yeah, apologies for the technical glitches, but if anyone has any further questions or would like to understand a bit more about the research, my email's on the screen there. You're more than welcome to get in touch, and I'll see if I can answer some of the questions just now, the Q&A as well.
Hannah, thanks very much indeed for that whistle-stop tour through the 4 options. There were some glitches from time to time. I think it might be a Wi-Fi issue. So some of the slides were a bit blurry, but we are going to be sharing all the slides so people can have a look at it in more depth when we get them sent out. I mean, I think it does show district heating and communal heating are things that aren't common in this country. That's a useful insight into some of the pros and cons of various models that will have to take place in the future as we try and decarbonise. And you certainly pulled out the pros and cons for each of the options that are there. So thanks indeed. We've got 10 minutes for questions, and there's a number that have come through. So I'm going to start with one that Betty in Ardguy sent, and I'm just trying to skim through to see if I can find it here. My apologies. I'll just be a second. Yeah, here we go. And this is a question from Magnus. Smart meters are not available locally due to a lack of infrastructure. How could provision of smart meters affect fuel poverty, particularly in conjunction with storage options such as sun amp heaters and EV chargers?
Yeah, really good question. I would suggest that they could be used to great effect in terms of trying to mitigate against fuel poverty by effectively utilising electricity, and this would be in specific to electricity rather than other fuel sources, when it's cheap, and not using it when it's expensive, particularly when it's linked up to heating, for example. The caveat I would put to that is that you need to be prepared to put the effort in and to work smartly, for want of a better term there. My household, for example, I have 3 kids, 2 of which are teenagers. I'm not convinced that they would work smartly and would need a little bit of coaxing to be able to use it to great effect. Also, I have a diesel car rather than an EV. But as these things come onto the markets, or as we acquire them, purchase them, even lease them. And the grids get a bit smarter themselves. I think the smart meters will become a really useful addition. Just one word extra here as well. The grid itself needs to kind of get a little bit better and a little bit smarter. Somebody had posted in the comments around, I think, £63 million of constraint payments in Sutherland alone for turning off onshore wind. How good would it be if we could start to dump some of that load into storage heaters, for example, at an extremely low price? That onus is on the grid rather than us as consumers. So there are really interesting projects ongoing, not least in Orkney. But yeah, this is a top-down and a bottom-up approach, but certainly smart meters, if you're prepared to use them properly, would be a very useful addition to households, I think, particularly in conjunction with other technologies like EVs and other energy storage means.
Thanks, Magnus. Yes, I think storage has still got some way to go to be the panacea, but it is interesting when you talk about Orkney, where I think it still has the highest preponderance of EV cars anywhere in the UK, and that's because they're grid constrained and generate and effectively use their car as their storage battery, so it can work. I'm aware Robert posed a statement, but I'd quite like to turn it into a question for you, Donald. Robert asked, the frustrating thing is how hard we had to push to make this research happen. Lots of time and energy that could have been used in other activities. Hopefully that never happens again if the Scottish Government is now on the same page as us. So my question from that was, are you confident now that the Scottish Government get it in relation to minimum income standards in remote rural and island areas?
Yes, they get their analysts absolutely get it. Politicians come and go, but the important thing is that it's enshrined in very clearly in legislation, which is meant to have a lifespan of 20 years. So you can never guarantee what politics will bring, but those two things that at a sort of analytical level, it's not. We've worked very well with the Scottish Government, and they're good at understanding these things. And I mean, it was very interesting that on the politics, how during the course of the committee of considering the bill and enacting it in the committee stages, that was a transformational process that I think it was well argued, and it came from lots of different parties. And I think that I actually remember writing at the time when I saw the final debate in which both two different parties sort of gave credit to others of reaching understanding. I thought, I wish Westminster was a bit like this. I mean, I know you sometimes feel frustrated, I'm sure, by your Parliament, but I actually thought there was a really good process of thinking about things and actually then acting on them.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. And I think I'll take a final question, if I can, here from Stuart Wilson. This is a question for you, Hannah. It's interesting that recently he's been bombarded by ambulance chasers for solar PV. Do you think that any of these models being discussed are more susceptible to this type of threat, and how can that be mitigated in any rollout?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean by ambulance chasers, but that might just be me. I mean, the models are they did have an emphasis on heat, but that can be solar heat. But there are opportunities for that to include electricity generation as well. It's quite a kind of transferable model. There were lots of different projects that were taken into account on this research, and those 4 models are real broad, and they're not this one size fits all solution. But yeah, I don't know if I'd be able to elaborate on the question, because I'm not sure what ambulance chasers means.
Sorry, ambulance cowboys. I think is we're saying wide boys. People that sadly there's a tradition, if that's the right word, of people from the Central Belt arriving off the ferry in the Western Isles, doing shoddy jobs, leaving a trail of destruction behind them, and local contractors having to pick it up. That's I suspect what he means.
Right. Well, in that case, I think there was one particular comment in there where the third parties you know, there can be these larger organizations, local authorities, and there's an element of trust there. These connections already exist with utility companies, for example, if they were to come and be the third parties for some of these larger heating schemes. And I suppose keeping the risks as far from the consumer as possible, and still ensuring that the sort of local supply chains as well can be integrated into these types of projects would be certainly one way to help mitigate that. But yes, I can appreciate that that's something that does happen. I think you're muted, Bob.
Sorry. There are a couple more questions, but I'm aware we're over time as it is, so I will pick them up, and they're directed to Magnus and Donald, and I think there's a third for Hannah there. So if they're happy enough, I'll send them on, and people can pick them up at or respond at their leisure. That would be great. Thanks, Magnus. That's a definite affirmative from Magnus anyway. So thank you again to all three speakers. Thought-provoking, interesting, and again some solutions focused as well, which is great to see.